Reddit, the crawl space date. I thought I was just dealing with a pretentious Tinder date, a slightly arrogant, overeducated guy who liked the sound of his own voice. I thought the worst case scenario was a boring story to tell my friends over brunch. I was wrong. I was so completely, naively wrong. Looking back, I realized that monsters don't always wear terrifying masks. Sometimes they wear tailored charcoal coats, drink single origin black coffee, and speak in a voice so smooth it completely numbs your survival instincts. I was 24 at the time. I had just graduated with a degree in graphic design and, by some stroke of absolute luck, scored a position at a major corporate agency right downtown. To anyone looking from the outside, I was living the dream of young independence. But if you've ever been in your early 20s, trying to make it in a new city alone, you know the reality. The strange, fragile mix of ultimate freedom and low-key baseline anxiety. You are suddenly responsible for everything: rent, bills, your own safety. You become hyper-aware of the world around you. With an entry-level salary, renting even a studio apartment in the city center was financially impossible. So, I did what most young professionals in my position do. I started looking at the outer suburbs. I wanted space, and I wanted quiet. I found a house that felt like a hidden gem. It was a charming, slightly older wooden home built back in the mid-1980s. It sat completely isolated at the dead end of a gravel road, surrounded by a sprawling yard that had been neglected for years, overgrown with wild grass and thorny bushes. The defining feature of the property was a dense, towering wall of massive pine trees that encircled the entire perimeter. It completely blocked the view of the nearest neighbors, who lived several hundred yards away behind the tree line. The house had a dusty little attic that I used to toss empty moving boxes into, and a deep crawl space beneath the floorboards. It was a classic raised foundation build, leaving about a 3-foot gap of dark dirt, support beams, and plumbing pipes between the actual ground and the wooden floor of the house. The only entrance to that crawl space was a small wooden hatch on the exterior back wall, completely hidden behind a massive, overgrown juniper bush. It was old, it was secluded, but to me it was paradise. It was a blank canvas. No roommates, no parents, no rules, just me and my transition into adulthood. My daily routine quickly became locked in. I would wake up early, make a coffee, and endure the 40-minute commute into the city. I'd work until late, often past 7 or 8 p.m., staring at monitor screens until my eyes ached. But there was one specific part of my daily routine that I absolutely, thoroughly loathed: the building's parking garage. The agency was located in a massive glass and steel office tower, and the employee parking was structured as a subterranean concrete maze sinking 3 levels beneath the earth. It was a brutalist nightmare. The fluorescent lights flickered with a sickening, low hum, leaving deep pockets of shadow between the concrete pillars. The air was perpetually damp, smelling of old oil and exhaust. Worse, there were endless blind spots that the outdated security cameras couldn't quite see. Walking from the elevator lobby to my car alone late at night always sent my heart straight into my throat. It's a fear that I think a lot of young women living alone share, is that instinctual primal dread of the unknown. You grip your keys between your knuckles, your ears straining for the sound of a footstep that doesn't match your own. You worry about someone slipping out from behind a pillar, or you play out worst-case scenarios in your head about ordering an Uber and getting into the wrong car. You tell yourself you're being dramatic, that you're just tired, but the fear is a physical weight in your chest. To blow off steam after those long, draining hours, and to cope with the suffocating silence of that big, isolated house, I started browsing Tinder. It became a mindless habit right before going to bed. I turn off the lights, curl up under my blankets, and scroll through profiles. It was a safe way to feel connected to the world without actually having to leave my couch. And that's how I met Julian. On paper, Julian was the exact definition of a good catch. He was 28, handsome in a very clean-cut, structured way, and his bio stated he worked as a senior data analyst in the exact same commercial complex as me, just 3 floors down. His profile pictures were carefully curated. One showed him in a crisp, tailored dress shirt, leaning against a mahogany bookshelf. Another showed him holding a leather-bound philosophy book at an upscale cafe, staring thoughtfully into a cup of black coffee. He radiated an intellectual, sophisticated aura. Sure, there was a palpable touch of arrogance in his prompts, but I interpreted it as confidence. He felt like a mature, established adult, a grounding contrast to the chaotic, transient college guys I was used to dating. I felt a genuine thrill when the screen lit up with the word match. Looking back at it now, my stomach turns. I had no idea that the trap had been meticulously engineered, and I had walked right into it with a smile on my face. We agreed to meet for our first date on a rainy Friday night at a dim, speakeasy-style cocktail bar located a few blocks from our office building. The weather was miserable. A heavy freezing rain was pelting the pavement, driving everyone indoors. When Julian walked into the bar, he looked exactly like his photos. He was wearing a sharp charcoal gray trench coat that looked expensive, and his hair was perfectly styled, unaffected by the wind outside. He smiled, slid into the booth across from me, and ordered a classic old-fashioned. In person, he was incredibly articulate. He spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence, his voice a smooth, low baritone. But within the first 30 minutes, the atmosphere began to shift. The red flags started popping up, but they were so subtle, so cloaked in polite intellectualism, that my conscious mind chose to ignore them. I was lonely, I wanted the date to go well, so I actively suppressed my own intuition. The first major red flag was the sheer, predatory intensity of his observation. Julian didn't look at me the way a normal guy looks at a woman he finds attractive. He didn't check me out or give me warm, nervous smiles. He studied me. His dark eyes were locked onto my face, and he barely seemed to blink. Whenever I spoke, he would tilt his head slightly, his gaze tracking the movement of my lips, the micro-expression of my eyebrows, the way my hands moved when I was nervous. When I laughed at a joke, I noticed that his eyes remained completely flat and cold. The muscles around his eyes didn't crinkle with genuine warmth. Instead, his gaze narrowed just a fraction, as if he was evaluating whether my laugh was authentic or measuring the exact psychological impact of his words. It felt like being cross-examined by a highly intelligent therapist who didn't actually care about your well-being, but was collecting data for a file. During a lull in the conversation, I brought up the stress of my new job and my daily anxieties. I laughed off my fear of the office parking garage, mentioning how creepy it was to walk through level P2 alone at 9 p.m. Julian didn't laugh. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his interlaced fingers. "You really shouldn't be alone down there," he said, his voice dropping an octave. A young woman, completely isolated in a subterranean concrete maze. It's the perfect environment for a predator. There are too many blind spots. The echoes mask the sound of approach. He paused, his eyes drilling into mine. "Which section do you normally park in? Are you close to the main elevators, or are you forced into the corners?" I felt a slight shiver, but I quickly rationalized it as chivalry. I thought he was just being protective, a man showing genuine concern for a woman's safety. I usually park in section 4B, I told him, right next to the old maintenance elevator. It's always deserted over there, but it's the only spot my permit allows. He nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a rhythmic silent beat against his glass. Section 4B, next to the maintenance shaft. Good to know. I didn't realize it then, but I had just handed him the coordinates to my vulnerability. The second red flag was his controlling nature, which was heavily disguised as intellectual superiority. As the night wore on, his sophisticated persona soured into a systematic, subtle form of psychological nagging. He began to correct and dismantle everything I said. I casually mentioned a fiction book I had recently finished and loved. He smirked, took a slow sip of his drink, and dismissed it as pedestrian trash designed for the unthinking masses. When I proudly showed him a few digital mock-ups of a branding project I had worked on that week, he didn't offer a single word of encouragement. Instead, he looked at the screen with a mixture of pity and amusement. "It's clean," he murmured, "but it's entirely commercialized. It's slave art. Your lung fee your youth creating meaningless aesthetics for corporate overlords. Your work lacks a soul." He said it with such calm authority that I found myself feeling defensive, even ashamed. He was intentionally lowering my self-esteem, testing my psychological boundaries to see exactly how much disrespect I would tolerate before I stood up for myself. And I, trapped by social conditioning, wanting to remain polite and avoid causing a scene in a nice bar, simply swallowed my pride and chose to smile it off. I shrank myself to make him feel larger. By 10:30 p.m., the psychological weight of the date became too much. I felt drained, uncomfortable, and a deep instinctual alarm bell was starting to ring in the back of my mind. I told him I had an early morning and needed to head home. Julian immediately called for the check and insisted on paying. As we stepped out of the warm bar into the freezing, torrential rain, he turned to me. His face was partially cast in shadow by the streetlights. "I know the drive back to your place in the outer suburbs gets incredibly dark and dangerous, especially past the old highway intersection," he said smoothly. "Let me call an Uber for your car, and I'll take a separate Uber right behind yours. I'll follow you all the way to your door to make sure you get inside safely." I froze. Every muscle in my body went completely rigid. The rain was drumming heavily against my umbrella, but inside my head, everything went dead silent. I had never told him which suburb I lived in. I had never mentioned the road I took, and I had absolutely 100% never mentioned the old highway intersection. Throughout the entire evening, I had only said, generally, that I lived about 40 minutes outside the city center. How did he know the exact geographic location of my house? How did he know the specific highway I took to get there? I looked at him, my heart beginning to race, my suspicion written all over my face. "How do you know I take the old highway?" I asked, my voice sharper than before. "I never told you where my house is." The moment I questioned him, Julian's intellectual polite mask slipped. It didn't just crack, it vanished for a terrifying fraction of a second. His face lost all expression. His eyes went completely dead, cold, flat and hollow, like the eyes of a shark or a dead fish. The charming smile was gone, replaced by a rigid, unreadable stare. "You mentioned it earlier when you were talking about your commute," he replied. His voice wasn't warm anymore. It was a perfectly flat, robotic monotone. "You must have forgotten. You're tired." I felt a wave of cognitive dissonance. Did I say it? I questioned my own memory. Maybe I did bring it up when I was complaining about the traffic. Don't be a crazy, paranoid girl. Don't ruin a Friday night over a misunderstanding. I gaslit myself because the alternative, admitting that this man was tracking me, was too terrifying to process. "No, I'm fine," I stammered, pulling my coat tighter around myself. "I have my car parked in the building garage anyway. I'll just drive myself. Thanks for the drink, Julian." I didn't wait for his response. I turned around and hurried down the street, my heels clicking loudly against the wet pavement, heading straight for the glass doors of my office tower. The transition from the bustling, albeit rainy city street into the office parking garage was jarring. By 11 p.m., the corporate tower was a ghost town. The cleaning crew was working on the upper floors, but the subterranean levels were completely abandoned. The descent into level P2 felt like stepping into a tomb of concrete and shadows. The air was heavy, smelling of cold moisture and stagnant air. My footsteps echoed loudly, bouncing off the walls, creating a rhythm that made me feel like I was being followed even when I wasn't. I held my car keys tightly in my right jacket pocket, the sharp metal edges of the house key digging painfully into the meat of my palm, using the physical pain to anchor myself against the rising panic. I walked faster, my eyes darting to the dark spaces between the parked SUVs. When I finally reached Section 4B, near the rusted heavy steel doors of the old maintenance elevator, I stopped. Clack, clack, clack. The distinct sharp sound of leather-soled dress shoes striking the concrete floor echoed from the dark corridor behind Pillar 12. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped the exact same instant I did. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling, sounding incredibly small in the massive garage. "Is someone there?" No answer. The only sound was the low, distant drone of the building's massive ventilation fans and the occasional drop of water leaking from an overhead pipe. I waited for 5 agonizing seconds, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness behind the pillar. Nothing moved. Bitten by pure, unadulterated panic, I ran the remaining 10 yards to my car. I hit the unlock button on my key fob, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut, immediately hitting the central locking button. The heavy thud of the car doors locking gave me a momentary illusion of safety. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely guide the key into the ignition. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and backed out of the space. As I swung the vehicle around and shifted into drive, my high-beam headlights cut through the gloom of Section 4B, illuminating the concrete pillars directly ahead of me. My heart stopped. There, standing directly beside Pillar 12, was a man. He was wearing a charcoal gray trench coat. He wasn't hiding behind a pillar anymore. He was standing perfectly straight, his hands casually shoved into his pockets. The harsh, white light of my high beams hit his face directly, exposing him. It was Julian. His eyes were wide, completely unblinking, staring straight through my windshield, locking eyes with me. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't wave. He didn't angry. He didn't smile. He just stood there like a statue, watching me. He had followed me into the building, followed me down the elevators, and tracked me to my exact parking spot. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal. My tires screeched against the smooth concrete floor as I tore away from Section 4B, racing up the exit ramps, bursting through the security gate, and flying out onto the wet city streets. I drove like an absolute maniac on the highway. I didn't care about speed limits. Every 3 seconds, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking every pair of headlights that appeared behind me. I was convinced a dark sedan would pull up and tail me. But by the time I rear into the gravel road leading to my house, the road behind me was completely dark. No one had followed me. When I pulled into my driveway, the isolated wooden house, surrounded by the dark, whispering pine trees, looked welcoming for the first time. The sprawling yard and the absolute seclusion felt like a protective shield, a fortress cutting me off from the horrors of the city. I sprinted from my car to the porch, unlocked the door, threw myself inside, and locked all 3 deadbolts. I went around the entire house, checking every single window latch, pulling down every heavy curtain until the house was a sealed box. I went upstairs to my bedroom, crawled into bed with my clothes still on, and pulled the duvet over my head. That night, sitting in the dark, I did what any modern person does to erase a threat. I went on a digital purge. I unmatched and blocked Julian on Tinder. I blocked his phone number. I blocked his name on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I cut every single digital thread that connected him to me. I lay awake until the sun came up, but as the daylight filtered through the cracks of the curtains, I managed to calm myself down. I told myself it was over. He was just a textbook, creepy, over-persistent stalker. He had crossed a massive line, but now he was blocked. He didn't know where I lived. The digital wall would protect me. I was wrong. That was just the prologue to a slow-burning, 2-week nightmare. Over the next 14 days, the atmosphere inside my home began to warp. It started with very small, almost imperceptible details. The kind of things that make you question your own sanity. If you don't live alone, you might not understand. But when you are the sole occupant of a space, you know exactly where everything belongs. You become the architect of your own environment. The first thing was the smell. It happened about 4 days after the date. I walked into my living room after work, and the air felt heavy. There was a faint, distinct scent lingering near the hallway, a smell that was entirely foreign to my house. It was earthy, damp, like wet mud mixed with the sharp, sour tang of stale body sweat. I checked the kitchen trash, cleaned the drains, and checked the tracking on my shoes, but found nothing. The smell would fade by morning, only to return a few days later. Then came the displacement of objects. One morning, I went into the kitchen to make breakfast. On the dining table, a single glass mug was sitting right in the center. I stood there, staring at it, a cold prickle of sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I am a creature of strict habit. I distinctly remembered washing that mug the night before and placing it upside down on the drying rack next to the sink. Yet, here it was, sitting on the table, shifted several feet away. Another day, I found a small decorative rug in my hallway, slightly crooked, bunched up against the wall as if someone had tripped over it. I blamed it on my own clumsiness. I told myself I was becoming hyper-vigilant, that the stress of the new job and the encounter with Julian was making me lose my mind. We are so quick to blame our own psychology rather than accept a terrifying physical reality. And then the auditory nightmares began. It started exactly a week into the 2 weeks. I was awoken out of a dead sleep by a sound. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath held. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:02 a.m. The house was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the window. I listened, my ears straining so hard they felt like they were vibrating. Sure, throot. It wasn't coming from the roof. It wasn't the wind rattling the old attic windows. It was coming from directly beneath my bed, deep down in the foundations of the house. It was a slow, heavy, rhythmic dragging sound. It sounded exactly like a large, heavy object or a human body slithering and pulling its weight through the loose, dry dirt of the crawl space under the floorboards. Sure. It would move for a few feet, stop for several minutes, and then move again, dragging itself along the path of the main water pipes. I sat frozen in my bed for 2 hours, terrified to make a sound, terrified to even let my feet touch the floor. I convinced myself it was wildlife. The house was old. The suburban woods were full of animals. It had to be an opossum, a stray dog, or a large raccoon that had found a tear in the exterior ventilation mesh. The next afternoon, I went to a local hardware store and bought several heavy-duty animal traps and a flashlight. I walked around the exterior of the house, shining the light through the bushes. When I reached the back wall, behind the overgrown juniper bush, I checked the access hatch to the crawl space. The small wooden door was shut, and the rusted metal latch was firmly in place. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Relieved, I set the traps with bait around the perimeter of the foundation, but the traps remained empty day after day. The bait was untouched. Yet, like clockwork, every single night at exactly 3 a.m., the dragging sound would return. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the faint vibrations through the mattress as something slithered through the dirt directly beneath me, separated from my body by only a few inches of old oak floorboards. This past Friday was the breaking point. It was the day my reality completely shattered. I had woken up that morning with a splitting headache and a low, burning fever. By 2 p.m., I couldn't concentrate on my design files anymore. My manager noticed how pale I was and told me to log off and go home. I arrived back at the house around 3:30 p.m. The afternoon sun was weak, casting long, pale orange beams of light through the living room windows. The absolute silence of the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. I took off my shoes, left them by the front door, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. My throat was parched, and I wanted to boil some water to make a hot cup of chamomile tea to soothe my fever. As I stood by the stove, waiting for the kettle to heat up, I stared mindlessly at the floor. My eyes tracked the grain of the wood, moving down the narrow hallway that led from the kitchen, past the bathroom, and into my bedroom. Halfway down the hall, I noticed something. The long woven runner rug that usually covered the entire length of the hallway. Floorboard had been shifted drastically to the side, bunched up against the baseboard. Beneath where the rug usually sat, a small dark blemish on the floor was exposed. It was an old note in the wood, about the size of a large coin, that had completely rotted out and decayed over the decades, creating a natural tiny peephole that looked straight down into the crawl space below. I had always meant to patch it, but I had just covered it with the rug and forgotten about it. I walked over to the rug, intending to kick it back into place with my foot. But as I stood directly over the small hole, a sudden, inexplicable wave of cold air hit my bare ankles. It was a draft coming up from the dirt below. A strange, sickening curiosity seized me. It was a purely instinctual impulse. I dropped down onto my hands and knees on the cold, hardwood floor. I lowered my head, closing my left eye, and pressed my right eye directly against the tiny rotted hole, peering down into the pitch-black void of the crawl space. At first, I saw absolutely nothing, just the deep, uniform ink of subterranean darkness. I expected to smell the familiar scent of damp earth and old insulation. Instead, a thick wave of that familiar, sour, ngai sweat smell hit my nose. And then a tiny light clicked on down in the darkness. It was a faint, dim, bluish-white glow. It was the unmistakable light of a smartphone screen set to the lowest brightness setting. The blue light shifted, tilting upward. The artificial glow illuminated a human face, lying completely flat on its back in the dirt, mere inches beneath the floorboard. The light had strayed onto his features. It was Julian. He was lying perfectly rigid on his back, his head positioned directly beneath the rotted knothole. He wasn't wearing his sharp suit or his charcoal trench coat. He was dressed in tight, filthy black clothing that was completely covered in dark mud, dust, and strands of white spiderwebs. His face was horrifyingly gaunt, his skin a pasty, translucent white from spending 2 weeks in total darkness, and his cheeks were covered in a rough, uneven stubble. But his eyes were wide open, completely dilated, the pupils swallowed by blackness. He was staring directly up through the coin-sized hole, locking his gaze into mine. He had been lying there in the dark, waiting for me to look. When he realized that I had finally discovered him, he didn't panic. He didn't try to flinch away or cover the light. Instead, the corners of his chapped lips slowly began to stretch outward. He opened his mouth into a wide, terrifying, unhinged smile that seemed way too large for his face, a silent, manic grin that exposed his teeth. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a dirt-caked right hand into the frame of the blue light. He placed a single fealty index finger against his lips, locking his unblinking eyes onto mine, and gave a silent, mocking gesture. Shh! I didn't scream. My vocal cords completely paralyzed, locking the air in my lungs. My brain experienced a momentary system failure, unable to process the sheer, cosmic horror of what I was looking at. For 2 weeks, this man had been living underneath my feet. Beaten by pure, primal survival adrenaline, my body reacted before my mind did. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my fingernails scratching frantically against the hardwood. I threw myself into the kitchen, chopped my phone off the counter, and bolted for the front door. I didn't grab my shoes. I didn't grab my keys. I didn't lock up. I tore open the heavy front door and ran barefoot down the gravel driveway. The sharp stones cut into the soles of my feet, but I didn't feel the pain. I sprinted through the overgrown yard, bursting through the tree line of massive pines, and ran out onto the main asphalt highway. I ran down the center of the road, sobbing hysterically, my breath coming in ragged, choking gasps. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped my phone twice before I finally managed to unlock the screen and dial 911. The police arrived in force exactly 10 minutes later, 3 squad cars screaming down the highway with their sirens blaring. They took me into the back of an officer's car, wrapping a shock blanket around my shoulders as I sat there, shivering uncontrollably, pointing toward the house. A team of 4 officers drew their weapons and cleared the perimeter. Behind a massive juniper bush on the back wall, they found a wooden access hatch to the crawl space. The metal latch hadn't been broken from the outside. Julian had actually unscrewed the entire hinge mechanism from the frame, allowing the door to slide open and shut perfectly without disturbing the lock, and then screwed it back in from the inside. Julian was gone. He had slipped out of the hatch and vanished into the dense, trackless pine forest behind the property the moment he heard me sprint out the front door. But what the police discovered inside that 3-foot dirt crawl space made even the most cynical, hardened detectives turn completely pale. He hadn't just been hiding down there for a few hours at a time. He had turned the space beneath my home into a functional bunker, Hanjambien Notan Mot Kai to Sin Hoat, directly beneath the exact floor area where my bed sat upstairs. Julian had laid out a heavy professional thermal sleeping bag. Surrounding the sleeping bag were dozens of empty plastic water bottles and crinkled fast food wrappers. My blood ran cold when the detective pointed to the brands on those wrappers. They were the exact items I had thrown into my exterior trash can over the past 2 weeks. He had been waiting until I left for work, crawling out of the hatch, raiding my garbage bins for my leftovers, and then crawling back under the floorboards to consume them. He had even installed a small battery-operated digital clock onto one of the wooden floor support beams, synchronized perfectly with the clock on my nightstand. And then, There was the notebook. It was a small black moleskin journal tucked inside the pocket of his sleeping bag. The detective initially refused to let me see it, citing the ongoing investigation, but during my official interview at the station, he read aloud a few entries to confirm my timeline. Hearing those words read in a sterile police interrogation room is something that will haunt my psyche until the day I die. Julian had been logging my entire life. He had recorded my daily routine with a level of meticulous, obsessive detail that was psychopathic, and the dates went back 3 full months. 3 months. That meant he had been stalking me, learning my work schedule, tracking my car, and scouting my house long before we ever matched on Tinder. The Tinder profile, the intellectual books, the shared workplace, it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a lucky match. It was a cold, engineered trap. He had created that specific profile because he had observed me enough to know exactly what kind of man I would gratify. He wanted to see if he could manipulate his way into my life through the front door first. When I blocked him, he simply chose the floorboards. The journal entries were written in a neat, cramped handwriting using red ink. May 14th, Target arrives home at 6:12 p.m. She is wearing the gray coat. She looks stressed. Left kitchen window unlocked by 2 millimeters. Need to monitor. June 2nd, she is using the Tinder app. Perfect. Calibrating profile parameters to match her intellectual preferences. Persona, the sophisticate. June 18th, 11:45 p.m. Lights out. She is asleep. I have successfully established the nest beneath her bedroom. The ventilation is adequate. I am directly beneath her now. I can hear her breathing through the floor. She is so beautifully oblivious. June 22nd, 3:14 a.m. She rolled over tonight. Her head is positioned right above the main support beam. I am resting my head against the wood on the other side. We are sleeping together. Only 3 inches of oak separate us. The police launched a massive manhunt. They ran a comprehensive background check on the name Julian, only to discover that the entire identity was a ghost fabrication. The social security number belonged to a man who had passed away in the 1990s. The data analyst job at the complex was a total lie. The office tower? He had never worked there as an analyst. He had been employed as a night shift security guard a year prior, but had been fired and blacklisted after a female employee caught him installing a pinhole camera, Gyao Kin, inside the vents of the executive women's restroom. He had simply copied the master keycard before his termination, allowing him free access to the subterranean parking garage levels. They issued a nationwide warrant for his arrest, plastering his composite sketch on the local news. But Julian had vanished into thin air. He had no real address, no vehicle registered in his name, no bank accounts, no family ties. He was a shadow that had temporarily taken human form to haunt me, and then dissolved back into the dark. I abandoned the house that very night. I didn't even go back to pack my clothes. I hired a moving company to throw my belongings into a truck while I stayed in a secure hotel, and I sold the lease back to the landlord at a massive financial loss. I fled the state. I moved thousands of miles away to a sprawling metropolitan city, determined to bury the memory under a mountain of concrete and noise. Currently, I live on the 15th floor of a modern, high-rise luxury apartment building right in the heart of the city center. I paid an exorbitant premium for peace of mind. The building has a 24-hour armed security guard in the lobby. The elevators require an encrypted biometric keycard scan just to select a floor. There are security cameras every 5 feet in the corridors. There are no yards, no overgrown bushes, no attics, and absolutely structurally no crawl spaces. My apartment is a box of solid, reinforced concrete and steel. For the past year, I finally thought I had bought my sanity back. I started sleeping through the night again, but 3 nights ago, the illusion of my safety was permanently torn to shreds. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep because of a lingering restlessness. It was late, dead silent save for the distant muffled hum of the city traffic 15 floors below. For some reason, a wave of nostalgia or morbid curiosity washed over me, and I reached into my nightstand drawer to pull out my old smartphone, the original device I had used back when I lived in that horrific wooden suburban house. I hadn't turned it on in over a year. I plugged it into the charger, booted it up, and watched the screen flicker to life. As the phone connected to my new apartment's Wi-Fi network, a barrage of old notifications began to pop up, syncing from cloud servers. Among the stream of old emails and app updates, a single notification caught my eye. It was an unread direct message from Tinder. The account that sent it was completely blank. No profile pictures, no bio, no name, just a default gray silhouette. The timestamp on the message read exactly 3:14 a.m., sent the very night after I had escaped from the crawl space. My breath hitched, a cold, heavy dread settling into my stomach. My fingers shook violently as I tapped the notification, opening the archived chat interface. The message was just a single short paragraph, written in that same flawless, chillingly articulate English of the man I had met in the cocktail bar. The reinforced concrete floor in your new 15th floor apartment is much thicker than the old oak floorboards of the house, my love. It takes a lot more effort to dampen the sound, but please know that if I crawl into the main maintenance shaft and press my ear right against the concrete directly beneath your bed, I can still hear your heartbeat. Sleep tight.